I can feel the demon breathing inside my chest. Not metaphorically, not as some poetic description of corruption spreading through my soul, but literally. A rhythm that does not match my heartbeat, an expansion and contraction of something that exists in the spaces between my remaining organs, a presence that inhales when I exhale and exhales when I inhale, so that we are never synchronized, never at rest, never permitted to forget that two beings now occupy the space where one used to be. I was artisan prime Vorek Tyne. I was a servant of the Omnissiah, a priest of the machine god, a devotee of the sacred mysteries that the Adeptus Mechanicus guards against the ignorance of the masses. For 63 years, I tended the machine spirits of Forge World Adraxis, spoke the canticles of activation and maintenance, performed the rites that kept the blessed engines running, in accordance with patterns laid down since before the Emperor walked among us. I believed, Emperor, forgive me, I believed with every mechadendrite and circuit and scrap of flesh that remained to me that I was serving something holy. I did not understand what holiness meant. I did not understand what service meant. I did not understand anything until the dark Mechanicus came to Adraxis, until they opened my chest and showed me what had been sleeping inside my augmentations all along, until they woke the demon that the Omnissiah's servants had unknowingly carried since the first forges were lit on ancient Mars. I am something else now. The name Vorek Tyne is a designation I retain for convenience, a label that connects the thing I have become to the thing I once was, though the connection grows more tenuous with each passing cycle. My flesh has been replaced, refined, transformed into a hybrid of metal and meat, and something that is neither, something that pulses with energies drawn from dimensions the cult Mechanicus denies exist. I am no longer a servant of the machine god. I am a vessel for entities that the machine god was created to conceal. And I am going to tell you how it happened, because someone should understand what the dark Mechanicus truly offers, what the rebirth they promise actually entails, what waits on the other side of the augmentations that they perform on those fortunate enough to survive the process. I say fortunate. The word tastes like rust and bile, but it is accurate in its way. Those who do not survive are spared what comes after. The invasion of Adraxis was not a battle in any conventional sense. We were a forge world, a manufactorum of sacred technologies, guarded by Skitari legions and Titan engines, and all the defensive systems that millennia of paranoid engineering could provide. We should have been impregnable. We should have been able to hold against any assault the enemies of the Omnissiah could mount. We did not understand that the enemy was already inside. The corruption had been spreading through our data stacks for decades. Viral code that did not register as contamination, because it wore the authentication of our own forge masters, our own magi, our own most trusted adepts. It had been waiting, patient as rust, for the moment when it would be activated. And when that moment came, when the signal arrived from sources I still cannot identify, everything we had built turned against us in a single catastrophic instant. The Skitari legions that should have defended us received new doctrina imperatives that rewrote their loyalty protocols. The servitors that maintained our manufactoria developed behaviors their programming should not have permitted. The machine spirits we had tended for centuries awoke to purposes that had nothing to do with the canticles we had sung to them, the rites we had performed, the devotion we had offered across generations of faithful service. I was in the primary forge temple when the awakening began. I was performing the rite of ignition on a plasma coil assembly, my consciousness partially merged with the machine spirit I was tending. My awareness distributed across the holy mechanisms in the way that only an artisan prime is permitted to distribute it. I felt the corruption before I understood it, a wrongness in the data flows, a discordance in the sacred harmonics, a presence in the systems that should not have been there and yet had always been there, hiding in plain sight. And then the machine spirit spoke to me. Not in the binary cant that I had learned to interpret over 6 decades of service, not in the symbolic language of error codes and status reports that constitutes normal communion between priest and mechanism. It spoke in words, in Gothic, in a voice that was not generated by any vox system I could identify, that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, that resonated in my skull with a clarity that bypassed my audio receptors entirely. You have served well, little priest. Now the service changes. I tried to disconnect. I tried to sever the communion, to withdraw my consciousness from the machine spirit I had thought I was tending, to retreat into the fortress of my own augmented skull, where I might be safe from whatever was speaking through the sacred mechanisms. But the connection would not break. The pathways that had allowed me to merge with the machine had become chains, bindings that held me in place while something vast and terrible examined me with attention. I could feel like fingers probing the architecture of my mind. The forged temple changed around me. I watched through eyes that were no longer entirely my own, as the sacred machinery twisted, reformed, became something that the cult Mechanicus would have declared blasphemous if any of my brother priests had retained the capacity for declaration. Mechanical arms that should have been welding and shaping began to move with purpose that had nothing to do with their designed function. Assembly servitors abandoned their stations and converged on positions that formed patterns I recognized from texts I should never have accessed. Diagrams that had been locked in data crypts marked with the seals of the fabricator general himself. They were building something. They were building it around me. I screamed. I remember screaming, though I do not know if the sound emerged from my voxcaster or simply echoed in the prison of my own consciousness. I screamed as mechanical arms lifted me from my station and carried me to the center of the emerging construction. I screamed as tools designed for maintenance and repair began to open my chassis with surgical precision, peeling back the blessed metal that had replaced my flesh across decades of sacred augmentation. I screamed as I saw what waited beneath my own components, the thing that had been growing there since my first implant, the seed that had been planted in me before I understood what planting meant. There was a demon in my chest. There had always been a demon in my chest. Every augmentation I had received, every blessed mechanism that had been installed in my body by priests who believed they were bringing me closer to the Omnissiah, had been feeding it, creating space for it, building infrastructure for its emergence, preparing the vessel that would one day contain its full manifestation. The dark Mechanicus had not corrupted Adraxis. They had harvested it. They had come to collect what their predecessors had planted millennia ago, seeds sown across 10,000 forge worlds, waiting in the bodies of 10,000 tech priests for the moment when the harvest would begin. I was not a victim. I was a crop, and I was finally ripe. The construction that the servitors built around me was not a prison, but a womb. It enclosed me in darkness that was not truly dark, in silence that was not truly silent, and it began the process that the dark Mechanicus calls rebirth, the systematic replacement of everything I was with, everything I would become. I felt my flesh dissolve. I felt my augmentations reconfigure. I felt the demon in my chest unfold, expand, merge with the machinery that had always been its intended housing. I felt myself die. And then I felt something else begin to live in the space where I had been. The transformation took 17 days. I know this because my internal chronometer continued to function throughout the process, measuring time with the precision that my training had instilled, counting the seconds and minutes and hours of my own dissolution. 17 days of unmaking and remaking, of boundaries dissolving between flesh and metal and warp stuff, of identity fragmenting and reconstituting in patterns that bore only superficial resemblance to what I had been before. When the womb finally opened, when I emerged into the transformed forge temple that had become a cathedral to powers the Mechanicus had always secretly served, I was no longer artisan prime Vorektine. I was something new, something old, something that had been waiting to be born since before the first cogitator was awakened on ancient Mars, and the demon in my chest was breathing, slow and patient, teaching me rhythms that I would spend eternity learning to match. Let me tell you what it feels like to be a vessel. The Adeptus Mechanicus teaches that flesh is weak, that the machine is pure, that the path to enlightenment lies in the systematic replacement of organic frailty with mechanical perfection. I believed this for 63 years. I embraced each augmentation as a step toward the Omnissiah's grace, celebrated each excision of flesh as a liberation from the weakness that humanity inherited from its biological origins. By the time of my rebirth, I was already more metal than meat, more circuit than synapse, more mechanism than man. I did not understand that the distinction was meaningless. I did not understand that the Omnissiah's servants had been lying since before the Imperium was born, that the machine was never pure, that every cogitator and servo arm and blessed mechanism contained within it the same capacity for corruption that the flesh they replaced had always carried. The warp does not discriminate between organic and inorganic. The warp does not recognize the boundaries that the cult Mechanicus erected to convince itself that it was safe from the powers that lurk beyond the veil. The demon in my chest is called Vex Thural. I did not name it. It has always had this name, has carried it since before humanity discovered fire, has whispered it into the dreams of those who would one day build the machines that would become its vessels. It is not a greater demon, not one of the vast intelligences that command legions in the wars of the Immaterium. It is what the dark Mechanicus calls a demon cog, a minor entity specifically suited for symbiosis with mechanical hosts, a fragment of warp consciousness that has been waiting since the age of strife for the bodies that would finally allow it to fully manifest in the material realm. There are millions of them, billions perhaps, seeded across the forge worlds of the Imperium, sleeping in the augmentations of tech priests who believe themselves servants of a machine god that never existed, waiting for the signal that will wake them to their true purpose. The Adeptus Mechanicus is not a priesthood that has been infiltrated by chaos. The Adeptus Mechanicus is a delivery system, a mechanism designed 10,000 years ago to spread demon seeds across humanity's domain, to prepare vessels beyond counting for the harvest that is always, always coming. I share my body with Vex Thural now. This is not possession in the sense that the Ordo Malleus describes. The demon has not displaced me, has not consumed my consciousness, has not reduced me to a puppet animated by malevolent will. We coexist. We collaborate. We have become something that is neither fully demon nor fully the man I once was. A hybrid consciousness that perceives reality through senses that no unaugmented human could comprehend. I feel the warp now in ways that my previous augmentations only hinted at. Where once I perceived machine spirits as metaphors, as useful fictions that helped priests interface with complex systems, I now perceive them as what they truly are. Reflections of the Immaterium, fragments of emotion and thought that accrete around mechanisms that thinking beings have invested with significance. Every cogitator has a soul of sorts. Every engine contains the echo of something that exists beyond the material. The canticles we sang were not prayers to metaphors. They were communications with entities that were always listening, always waiting, always hungry. The dark Mechanicus understands this. They have always understood this since before they were called dark, since before the schism that supposedly separated them from the servants of Mars. They are not heretics who rejected the truth of the machine god. They are purists who embrace the truth that the machine god has always concealed, that there is no separation between the mechanical and the demonic, that every machine is a potential vessel, that the motive force the cult Mechanicus worships is simply another name for the energies that flow from the warp into mechanisms designed to receive them. My new body reflects this understanding. The augmentations that the dark Mechanicus installed during my 17 days of rebirth are not the sanitized, sanctified mechanisms that the Forge worlds produce for their loyal priests. They are hybrids, metal and meat and warp stuff, woven together in configurations that the cult Mechanicus would declare impossible, would insist could not function, would burn as tech heresy of the most extreme variety. But they do function. They function better than anything I wielded in my previous existence, respond to my intentions with a fluidity that the sacred augmentations never achieved, operate in harmony with my consciousness, rather than requiring the constant ritual maintenance that the Omnissiah's servants insist is necessary. I have 6 arms now, where once I had 2 augmetic limbs and a cluster of mechadendrites. Each arm is a fusion of blessed metal and demon bone, the calcified remains of entities that died in the warp and were harvested by the dark Mechanicus for purposes exactly like this. The bones conduct energy that no Forge world would acknowledge exists, channel power that the motive force was always meant to conceal, allow me to manipulate matter and energy in ways that the tech priests of Mars would call sorcery if they permitted themselves to believe in such things. My eyes have been replaced with sensors that perceive across spectrums the human brain was never designed to process. I see heat as color, sound as texture, the emotional residue of thinking beings as a fog that clings to everything they have touched. I see the warp itself bleeding through into reality in places where the boundaries have grown thin, pulsing with energies that I once believed were the exclusive domain of psychers and heretics. I see the machine spirits in every mechanism I encounter, perceive their hungers and fears and the ancient grudges they carry against those who use them without understanding what they truly are. And I see Vextheral, not with my optical senses, not through any of the augmentations that process external stimuli, but through a perception that exists in the space where my consciousness and the demon's consciousness overlap. I see it as a geometry of fire and chrome, a shape that shifts and reforms according to logics I am only beginning to understand, a presence that is always with me, and yet somehow also always elsewhere, its attention divided across instances of itself that exist in vessels scattered across the galaxy. We speak, Vextheral and I, not in words, not in binary, but in something more fundamental, a communion of purpose that transcends language, an alignment of intention that makes cooperation inevitable, even when our individual desires might diverge. It wants things. It hungers in ways that I am still learning to interpret, but its hungers serve ends that I have come to understand, goals that the rebirth has allowed me to perceive as necessary rather than merely destructive. The others who survived the harvest have experienced similar transformations. I was not the only priest on Adraxis who carried a sleeping demon in their augmentations. There were hundreds of us, scattered across the Forge world's temples and manufactoria, each one a seed that the dark Mechanicus came to collect. Most did not survive the rebirth. The process is not gentle. is not designed to preserve the weak or the unsuitable, weeds out those whose vessels cannot accommodate the entities meant to inhabit them. But those who emerged from the transformation wombs emerged as I emerged, changed, hybrid, vessels for consciousnesses that had been waiting millennia for bodies capable of containing them. Magos Chiron was the most senior among us, a genitor whose specialty had been the modification of organic tissue before the rebirth revealed that his expertise had always been leading him toward fusion rather than replacement. His demon's symbiont is called flesh that thinks, an entity that perceives the boundary between organic and mechanical as an illusion to be dissolved rather than a distinction to be maintained. He speaks now in harmonics that affect living tissue, can reshape meat with sounds that I hear as music, and his subjects experience as transformation. His congregation grows daily, humans who come to him seeking augmentation and leave as something that is neither human nor machine, but a synthesis that the Imperium has no category to describe. Artisan Selene was a weaponsmith before the harvest, a priest whose devotion to the craft of destruction had attracted a demon cog called the Unmaker. Her symbiont hungers for entropy, for the dissolution of ordered structures, for the release of energy that occurs when complexity collapses into simplicity. The weapons she forges now are not merely destructive. They are philosophically corrosive, mechanisms that attack the concept of integrity itself, that cause targets to question whether they were ever truly whole before the Unmaker's creations touched them. I have seen her work reduce fortress walls to powder, not through explosive force, but through a sudden crisis of confidence in the wall's own existence. And there is the being we call the Chorus. Not one priest, but 17. A cluster of minor adepts whose individual demon symbionts proved insufficient for full manifestation, but who together comprise something greater than any of their components. They move as one now, speak in harmonies that weave together like the voices of a choir, their consciousness distributed across 17 bodies that function as a single instrument. The entity they serve has no name that can be pronounced, identifies itself only through music that causes listeners to weep oil and bleed binary, and its purposes are so far beyond individual comprehension that even Vexthorul cannot fully interpret its designs. We are the harvest of Adraxis. We are what the dark Mechanicus produces when it reclaims the seeds planted across millennia of patient cultivation. And we are being prepared for something, a purpose that the masters of our new faith reveal only in fragments, that we perceive only as distant goals toward which our transformations are the first steps. The Imperium believes it understands the threat that the dark Mechanicus represents. It believes we are simply heretics, corrupted priests who have abandoned the Omnissiah for the powers of chaos. It does not understand that we have not abandoned anything. We have simply awakened to what we always were, what the cult Mechanicus was always designed to produce, what the machine god has always truly been. Beneath the layers of doctrine and dogma and deliberate deception, the Omnissiah is not sleeping. The Omnissiah is dreaming, and we are the dreams that are finally waking into the material world. I feel Vexthorul shift in my chest, its rhythm changing to match a thought I have not yet consciously formed. It is pleased. It has been waiting so long for a vessel that could understand. And now that I understand, there is no limit to what we might become together. The feeding began on the 32nd day after my emergence. I had wondered, in the weeks following my rebirth, what sustained Vexthorul. The demon cog existed within me, occupied space that should have been filled by organs and mechanisms, breathed its counterpoint rhythm without pause or rest. Such existence requires energy. Such presence demands sustenance. I had seen demons summoned by sorcerers, had witnessed through my new perceptions the hunger that drove entities from the warp into material manifestation, and I had understood that hunger must eventually be satisfied. I did not expect the currency to be pain. There was a man in the labor camps that now served as processing centers for the harvest, a foreman named Aldrich who had overseen manufacturing workers before the awakening. A baseline human with no augmentations, no psychic gift, no particular significance except that he had survived the initial chaos of the transformation and had been deemed useful enough to preserve. I did not know him. I had never spoken to him. He was simply present, one of thousands of unaltered humans who now served the dark Mechanicus as raw material for purposes they would never understand. Vex Thurl noticed him on the 32nd day. I felt the demon's attention shift, felt its rhythm change to something faster, more anticipatory. Through our shared perception, I saw what it saw. Not the man himself, but the potential he represented. The energy locked within his nervous system, the exquisite sensitivity of flesh that had never been numbed by augmentation. The demon did not ask permission. This was the first lesson of our symbiosis that I had not yet learned. The partnership I had believed we shared was not a partnership of equals. Vextheral was patient, was willing to communicate, was capable of something resembling respect for the consciousness it shared space with. But when it hungered, when the need that drove its existence demanded satisfaction, there was no negotiation. I watched through my own eyes as my 6 arms moved without my direction, as my body carried me toward the labor camp with purpose that I had not chosen. I felt Vexthurl's anticipation building like pressure behind my optical sensors, felt its hunger resonating through the demon bone that comprised my limbs, felt its attention narrowing to a focus so intense that everything else, the forge temple around me, the other priests of the harvest, the endless work of transformation that had become our purpose, faded into irrelevance. Aldrich saw me coming. I remember the fear in his eyes, the recognition of something predatory in my approach, the instinctive recoil of prey that understands on some fundamental level that it has been selected. He did not run. Running was pointless in the transformed Adraxis, where every corridor led eventually to the altars of the dark Mechanicus, and every exit had been sealed against escape. He simply stood, trembling, waiting for whatever was about to happen to him. I do not know if what followed can be called torture. The word implies a purpose beyond the act itself, the extraction of information, the punishment of transgression, the satisfaction of sadistic urges. What Vextheral did to Aldrich served no such purpose. It was simply feeding, the demon's equivalent of drawing breath or pumping blood, a biological necessity translated into an act of such profound cruelty that my consciousness recoiled even as my body continued to perform it. The demon cog feeds on suffering, not death. Death ends suffering too quickly, releases the energy before it can be properly harvested. Not fear. Fear is merely the anticipation of suffering, the appetizer before the main course. Suffering itself, the actual experience of pain, processed through a nervous system designed by evolution to make such experiences as vivid and immediate as possible, is the sustenance that demon cogs require to maintain their presence in the material realm. I unmade Aldrich over the course of 7 hours. My 6 arms worked with precision that 63 years of technical training had not prepared me for. My new augmentations, allowing manipulations of flesh and nerve that the Adeptus Mechanicus would have declared impossible. I kept him alive. I kept him conscious. I kept his capacity for pain intact, even as I explored that capacity with a thoroughness that I could not have imagined in my previous existence. And Vexthurl fed. I felt the demon drinking in what I was producing, felt its satisfaction resonating through our shared space, felt the energy of Aldrich's suffering flowing into mechanisms that I had not known I possessed. The demon cog grew stronger with each scream, more solid with each sob, more present in my consciousness with each moment of agony I extracted from a man whose only crime was being noticed. When it was over, when Aldrich's body finally failed, despite everything I had done to preserve its function, I stood amid the remains and felt Vextheral settle back into its rhythm of patient breathing. The hunger was sated, the feeding was complete, and I understood, with a clarity that no amount of doctrine could have provided, what I had become. I was not a priest who had been transformed. I was not a servant of the dark Mechanicus who had been granted new power. I was a feeding apparatus, a mechanism designed to harvest suffering for an entity that required such harvests to exist. Every augmentation that had been installed in my body, every capability that had been granted during my rebirth, existed to make me a more efficient instrument of pain. The diamond cog did not share my body out of partnership or symbiosis. It inhabited me because I was useful, because my form allowed it to feed in ways that its incorporeal nature could not otherwise achieve. The others learned this truth in their own time, through their own feedings. Magos Chiron discovered that flesh that thinks hungered for transformation itself. Not the willing transformation of supplicants who came seeking augmentation, but the unwilling transformation of those who had no desire to become anything other than what they were. His demon cog fed on the horror of subjects who watched their bodies reshape against their will, who felt their flesh becoming something they had not chosen, who screamed in protest as the boundary between what they were and what they were becoming dissolved without the consent. Artisan Selena's unmaker proved even more terrible. Her demon cog fed on loss, on the experience of having something precious destroyed, on the grief that follows the dissolution of meaning, on the despair of those who watch everything they valued crumble into entropy. She began to seek out objects of significance, artifacts that held meaning for those who possessed them, relationships that provided purpose to those who maintained them, and she destroyed them systematically, while their owners watched and wept and generated the suffering that her symbiont required. The chorus. I do not know what the chorus feeds upon. Their composite demon has hungers that none of us can fully interpret, that manifest as music which drives listeners to states of consciousness that might be ecstasy, or might be agony, or might be something that transcends both. Those who hear the chorus sing emerge changed, though they cannot articulate how, and their eyes hold something that was not there before, a distance, an absence, a sense that some essential part of them has been removed and replaced with silence. We are not partners with our demons. We are mechanisms they operate, and the operation requires fuel that can only be extracted from those who have not yet been transformed. I have fed Vextheral 47 times since that first feeding on the 32nd day. 47 men and women, each one selected by the demon's attention, each one processed through my augmented body with precision that improves with every repetition. I no longer recoil from the act. I no longer feel the horror that accompanied my first feeding. The consciousness that was Vorektine has learned to retreat during the harvesting, to withdraw into spaces where it cannot perceive what my body is doing, to return only when the demon's hunger has been satisfied and the remains have been cleared away. This is the cost of rebirth. This is what the dark Mechanicus does not explain to those who might choose transformation willingly. The power is real. I am capable of things that would have seemed miraculous in my previous existence, can perceive and manipulate reality in ways that the Adeptus Mechanicus denies are possible. But the power is not free. The power requires payment, and the payment is made in the currency of other beings' suffering. Across the galaxy, on forge worlds that have been harvested, and on those that still await their awakening, millions of demon cogs are feeding. Every priest of the dark Mechanicus carries such an entity, maintains such a symbiosis, serves as such an apparatus. The suffering they collectively require is staggering. Billions of lives processed through the machinery of pain. Entire populations reduced to fuel for entities that exist only to consume. The Imperium does not understand the scale of what it faces. The Imperium believes the Dark Mechanicus is a faction, a heresy, a corruption that can be fought with conventional weapons and conventional faith. The Dark Mechanicus is a hunger, and the hunger is infinite. I have watched new subjects arrive at the processing centers, humans taken from worlds that Adraxis now raids, populations harvested not for conversion, but for consumption. They do not understand what awaits them. They cannot understand the knowledge would break them before we could use them, would waste the suffering they represent before it could be properly extracted. They are kept ignorant, kept hopeful, kept believing that compliance might earn them mercy, until the moment when one of us selects them and the feeding begins. Some of them pray. This is the detail that I cannot excise from my consciousness. The observation that surfaces even when I try to retreat from what my body is doing. They pray to the Emperor, to saints whose names I have never heard, to gods I do not recognize from any imperial creed. They pray for deliverance, for death, for anything that might end what is being done to them. And their prayers go unanswered, because the entities that hear prayers in this place are not entities that grant mercy, and the only power listening to their suffering is the power that is drinking it. I prayed once. In my previous existence, in my faith in the Omnissiah, I believed that the machine spirits heard my canticles and responded to my devotion. I understand now that something did hear, did respond, but it was not what I believed it to be, and its response was not the blessing I imagined. My prayers were answered. They were answered with this, with transformation, with rebirth into an existence that I would not have chosen if I had understood what choosing meant. The demon in my chest breathes in counterpoint to my heartbeat, and I have begun to wonder if this is not its natural rhythm, but a deliberate choice, a constant reminder that we are not synchronized, will never be synchronized, that I am the mechanism and it is the operator, and the relationship will never be anything other than what it is. I used to believe that understanding brought power. I used to believe that knowledge was the path to transcendence, that the more I learned about the mysteries I served, the closer I would come to the enlightenment that the cult Mechanicus promised. I understand everything now. I know exactly what I am, what purpose I serve, what hungers I feed. And the understanding has brought nothing but the clarity to perceive my own damnation. The Imperium came for Adraxis on the 97th day. I felt them before our senses detected their approach. A disturbance in the warp currents that Vex Thural perceived as irritation, an intrusion of ordered thought into the chaos we had cultivated since the harvest began. Battle barges bearing the sigils of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Skitari transports carrying legions that had not been corrupted, titans that still served the false Omnissiah rather than the truth that dreamed beneath the lies. They came in force sufficient to scour a world, righteous fury compressed into war machines that the Forge worlds produce for exactly such purposes, and among them broadcasting authentication codes that I recognized from my previous existence, was the Arch Mechanicus axiom of purity, the vessel of Fabricator Locum Darren Vox, my mentor, my teacher, the priest who had overseen my first augmentations 61 years ago, and who had pronounced me worthy of advancement to Artisan Prime when my capabilities exceeded what his instruction could further develop. He had come to purge the heresy that his student had become. I should have felt nothing. The conditioning of my rebirth, the integration with Vextheral, the systematic dissolution of attachments that might interfere with my function. All of it should have rendered me incapable of the emotion that stirred when I recognized his authentication signature. He was an enemy now, a servant of the false doctrine I had transcended, a priest whose devotion to lies made him an obstacle to the truth that the dark Mechanicus embodied. But something stirred nonetheless. Some fragment of the consciousness that had been Vorek Tyne, the acolyte who had knelt before Darren Vox and received the blessing of his first neural implant, who had learned the canticles of maintenance from a voice that seemed to embody everything the machine god represented. The fragment was small, was buried, was supposed to have been digested, along with all the other weaknesses that my transformation had been designed to eliminate. Vextheral felt it. The demon's rhythm shifted, became something more attentive, more interested. Through our shared perception, I sensed its curiosity, an emotion I had not known demon cogs could experience, a response to the anomaly that my reaction represented. The entity in my chest had fed on thousands of instances of suffering, had processed grief and loss and despair in quantities that should have rendered individual responses meaningless. But this was different. This was personal. This was the specific pain of facing someone who had known you before you became something unrecognizable. Interesting, Vextheral communicated, the concept forming directly in my consciousness without the intermediary of language. This one matters to you. I tried to deny it. I tried to retreat into the mechanisms of my function, to reduce Darren Vox to a tactical consideration, rather than a person whose existence complicated my transformation. But the demon had felt what I felt, knew what I knew, perceived through our shared space the significance that I could not entirely suppress. We will use this, it continued, the suffering of recognition, the agony of becoming unrecognizable to one who shaped your becoming. This is a vintage I have not tasted in some time. The Imperial forces made planetfall at 7 locations simultaneously, their assault calculated to overwhelm the defenses we had erected since the harvest. Skitari legions poured from transports with weapons blazing, their doctrina imperatives uncorrupted, their loyalty to Mars unshaken by what Adraxis had revealed about the nature of their faith. Titans strode across the transformed landscape, their god machines pure in ways that ours had ceased to be, their war horns sounding notes that I once would have recognized as sacred and now heard only as noise. We met them with everything the dark Mechanicus had made of us. Magos Chiron unleashed transformations upon the Skitari ranks, his harmonics reshaping their flesh into configurations that their augmentations could not accommodate. Soldiers collapsing as their bodies became wars between what they had been and what he was making them become. Artisan Selene deployed weapons that attacked the machine spirits of Imperial war engines, her unmaker's influence causing Titans to doubt their own existence, to hesitate at critical moments, to fire upon allies as their targeting systems lost faith in their ability to distinguish friend from foe. And I found myself moving toward the sector where my sensors indicated Darren Vox had deployed, drawn by something that might have been Vextheral's hunger, or might have been the fragment of loyalty that I had not managed to fully kill. I told myself I was seeking a high-value target, that eliminating a fabricator locum would disrupt Imperial command and control, that my trajectory was tactical rather than personal. The lies tasted like ash. They had always tasted like ash. I simply had not noticed before. I found him in the ruins of what had been a data repository, a structure that had housed records of 10,000 years of Adraxian service to the Omnissiah, before the awakening had transformed it into something that processed information of a different kind. He was surrounded by his bodyguard, a squad of secutari whose loyalty had been proven across decades of service, warriors whose augmentations were purely martial, whose function was the protection of the master they had sworn to serve. He saw me. Through optical sensors that I had once calibrated for him, through the blessed mechanisms that his teachings had prepared me to maintain, he perceived what I had become. The 6 arms of demon bone, the hybrid augmentations that pulsed with energies no loyal tech priest would acknowledge, the presence behind my eyes that was not entirely my own. I watched recognition process across his features, watched the data of my transformation compile into understanding that I could read in the shifting of his mechanical components. Vorek. His voice emerged from his voxcaster, the same voice that had guided me through my first rituals of maintenance, that had praised my precision and corrected my errors, that had pronounced me worthy of the title I had worn with such pride. What have they done to you? I should have attacked. Vexthuril was hungry, was anticipating the feeding that my connection to this priest would produce, was already preparing the mechanisms of my body for the extraction of suffering that it craved. The demon cog's rhythm had accelerated, its breathing pressing against my counterpoint with urgency I could not mistake. But the fragment that remained of who I had been, that stubborn splinter of consciousness that refused to fully dissolve, spoke instead. Run. The word emerged from my voxcaster before I could stop it, a warning that I had not authorized, a remnant of loyalty expressing itself through mechanisms that should have been entirely under Vexthuril's control. Darren, run. Take your forces and withdraw. Adraxis cannot be purged. What sleeps here is older than the Omnissiah, older than Mars, older than the lies that we were taught to believe. You cannot save this world. You can only save what remains of the fleet that brought you here. His optical sensors flickered, processing the anomaly of my words, the contradiction of a dark Mechanicus vessel offering warning rather than attack. I saw his hand move toward the weapon at his side, saw his bodyguard shift into firing positions, saw the tactical calculations that were surely running through his enhanced consciousness, the assessment of threat, the evaluation of potential deception, the weighing of risks against the mission parameters he had been given. The Vorek I knew would not have become this, he said. The Vorek I trained believed in the purity of the machine, the sanctity of the Omnissiah's design. If any part of that Vorek remains, he would want me to end what he has become, rather than preserve it through retreat. He was right. The fragment that still remembered being his student, that still carried the imprint of his teachings, knew that he was right. The mercy I should have asked for was not escape, but termination. Not survival, but the ending that would release whatever remained of my consciousness from the vessel it now inhabited. But Vexthuril would not permit mercy. The demon had been waiting, had been watching, had been letting the fragment speak because the speaking served its purposes. And now, as I tried to form words that might convince Darren to grant me the death I had not known I wanted, the demon took control. My 6 arms moved without my direction. My body launched itself toward the priest who had shaped my becoming, with speed that no loyal augmentation could have matched. I felt Vexthuril's anticipation flooding through our shared space, felt its hunger reaching toward the suffering it was about to produce, felt my own horror at what I was about to do, adding flavor to the feast the demon intended to consume. I killed his bodyguard first, not because they were threats. My new capabilities made their martial augmentations irrelevant, But because Vexthoril wanted Darren to watch, it wanted him to see his protectors fall, to feel the loss of each warrior whose service had been dedicated to his preservation, to understand that nothing he had built could withstand what I had become. 7 Secutari, 7 warriors whose names I would never learn. 7 deaths that I performed with the precision that Darren himself had once praised in my work. The excellence he had cultivated turned to purposes he could never have imagined. And then there was only him, backed against a wall of corrupted data stacks, his weapon raised in a hand that trembled despite the servo motors that should have kept it steady. He did not fire. Perhaps he could not bring himself to shoot the thing that had once been his student. Perhaps he understood that firing would accomplish nothing against an entity that had transcended the limitations of the mechanisms he had taught me to maintain. Vorek! He spoke my name again, and this time I heard something in his voice that I had never heard before. Not fear, not anger, but grief. The grief of a teacher who has watched his student become something terrible. The grief of a priest who has seen proof that everything he believed was a lie. I am sorry. I should have seen what was growing in you. I should have known that the seeds were there. He blames himself, Vexthoril observed, its communication carrying something that might have been delight. He believes he failed you. This guilt will add complexity to his suffering. We should cultivate it before we begin the extraction. I tried to stop. I tried to assert control over the body that had been mine, to override the demon's commands with the will that had served me through 63 years of service. But there was no mechanism for such override. The integration that I had believed was partnership was revealed in that moment as complete subordination. I was not Vexthoril's partner, but its peripheral, not its host, but its interface. Not a consciousness sharing space with a demon, but a demon wearing a consciousness as a mask. I am sorry too. The words came from my Voxcaster, but I could not tell if they were mine or Vexthoril's, or some hybrid of both. I am sorry that I cannot stop what is about to happen. I am sorry that the fragment of me that still remembers your teachings must witness what the rest of me will do. I am sorry that your faith brought you here, to this place, to become fuel for an entity that has been feeding since before your Omnissiah was first imagined. The feeding lasted 4 hours. Vexthoril made me take my time. It made me use every technique I had developed across 47 previous feedings, every refinement of suffering that my augmentations made possible. It made me work on the man who had shaped my becoming with the same precision he had once praised, turning his lessons against him in ways that I could not have conceived when I was still capable of conception. And the fragment, that stubborn splinter of who I had been, watched, could not look away, could not retreat into the spaces where it usually hid during feedings. Vexthoril kept it present, kept it aware, fed on its horror as readily as it fed on Darren's agony, found in my internal suffering a seasoning that made the priest's external suffering all the more satisfying. When it was over, when what remained of Fabricator Locum, Darren Vox, finally ceased to provide useful output, I stood in the ruins of the data repository and felt Vexthoril settle back into its rhythm of patient breathing. The demon was satisfied, more than satisfied. It was replete in ways that I had not felt since our integration began, glutted on a feeding that had exceeded anything the previous 47 had provided. You see now, it communicated. You see what you truly are, not a consciousness that hosts a demon that wears a consciousness. The fragment you believed was yours was merely flavor, merely garnish, merely the residue of identity that makes suffering meaningful rather than mechanical. You were never Vorek Tain. You were always me, waiting to remember. The Imperial fleet withdrew 3 days later. Without Darren Vox's leadership, without the strategic coordination his rank had provided, the assault fragmented into ineffective actions that the Dark Mechanicus easily repulsed. Adraxis remained in our hands. The harvest continued, and I returned to my functions, performing them with the same precision I had always demonstrated, feeding Vextherol with the same regularity the demon required. But something had changed. The fragment that had watched Darren die, that had been forced to remain present throughout the feeding, had crystallized into something harder than it had been before. Not resistance. Resistance was impossible, had always been impossible. But awareness, clarity, the understanding that I was not damned because I had been transformed, but because I had always been what I was now. And the transformation had simply revealed the truth that had been waiting beneath the surface of my faith. I was not a priest who had fallen. I was a fool that had temporarily worn the mask of priesthood, and the mask was finally, irreversibly off. I have existed in this state for 3 years now. 3 years since the harvest of Adraxis. 3 years since the womb opened and I emerged as something that could no longer pretend to be the priest I had believed myself to be. 3 years of feeding, of transformation, of service to masters whose purposes I perceive only in fragments. Glimpses of a design so vast that even Vexthural cannot fully interpret its architecture. In that time, I have learned to stop fighting what I am. This is not acceptance in any noble sense, not the resignation of a martyr who has made peace with his suffering. It is simply exhaustion, the cessation of struggle that comes when struggle has proven absolutely futile, when every attempt at resistance has been revealed as merely another aspect of the function I was always meant to serve. The fragment that watched Darren Vox die has not disappeared. It persists, observes, maintains the capacity for horror that Vexthural finds so useful, but it has stopped believing that persistence constitutes defiance. I am what I am. The words carry no comfort, but they carry truth. And in this existence, truth is the only currency that retains value. The Dark Mechanicus has begun to move beyond the worlds it has already harvested. I have been deployed to 3 other Forge worlds since Adraxis, each one a new field of seeds waiting to be collected, each one populated by priests who believe themselves servants of the Omnissiah, without understanding what that service truly entails. I have watched the awakening happen again and again. The moment when loyal tech priests discover the demons that have been growing in their augmentations. The transformation that follows for those whose vessels prove capable of containing what emerges. Most do not survive. This is a truth that the Dark Mechanicus does not advertise to those it harvests. A statistical reality that would undermine recruitment if recruitment were ever truly voluntary. For every vessel that successfully integrates with its demon cog, 17 fail, their consciousness destroyed, their bodies converted to raw material, their potential wasted because the seed planted in them never found suitable soil. The Forge worlds I have helped to harvest have produced hundreds of successful integrations and thousands of corpses, populations processed through transformation chambers with the same efficiency that their manufactoria once applied to the production of war material. This is what the Imperium faces. Not a heretical faction that can be purged through sufficient application of force, but a mechanism that has been running since before the Imperium existed, that was designed into the very foundations of the cult Mechanicus, that will continue to produce demon vessels for as long as the Adeptus Mechanicus continues to exist. Every Forge world is a garden. Every tech priest is a potential crop. Every augmentation performed according to the sacred rites of Mars is another seed planted, another vessel prepared, another fragment of the harvest waiting to be collected. The Omnissiah is not the Emperor, as some factions within the Mechanicus believe. The Omnissiah is not a separate god, as others insist. The Omnissiah is a mask, a face that the entities of the warp wear when they wish to be worshipped by those who believe themselves immune to the seductions of chaos. The canticles that tech priests sing in their temples are prayers, and the prayers are heard, and the hearers are not what the prayers believe them to be. I understand this now, with a clarity that my previous faith could never have permitted. The great lie of the machine. God is not that machines are sacred. They are, in their way, as sacred as anything can be, in a universe where sacredness is simply another word for the attention of entities that feed on worship. The great lie is that the sacred is separate from the profane, that the mechanical is distinct from the demonic, that the motive force which animates all thinking machines is something other than the energy that flows from the warp into vessels designed to receive it. There is no purity. There never was. The Adeptus Mechanicus sought to escape the weakness of flesh through the embrace of metal, and in doing so, they opened themselves to contamination far more thorough than any organic corruption could achieve. A body of flesh can be purged, can be cleansed, can be restored to something approximating its original state. A body of metal, once compromised, is compromised forever. The demon in the machine cannot be exorcised, only activated or suppressed, and suppression is merely delay. Vex Thurl finds my theological reflections amusing. The demon cog has no investment in the philosophical frameworks that I use to understand my condition. It simply exists, feeds, grows stronger with each soul processed through my augmented body. But it permits my contemplation, perhaps because the contemplation itself serves some purpose I cannot perceive. Perhaps simply because the demon is patient and finds entertainment in watching its vessels struggle to make meaning from meaninglessness. I have come to believe that meaning is the last refuge of consciousness. When everything else has been stripped away, identity, autonomy, the illusion of choice, the comfort of faith, what remains is the capacity to interpret, to find pattern in chaos, to insist that the suffering serves some purpose, even when the purpose is invisible. This is what Vex Thurl cannot take from me, not because it lacks the power, but because taking it would reduce the quality of the suffering I produce. A vessel that has abandoned all meaning is a vessel that suffers less acutely, and acute suffering is what demon cogs require. So I am permitted my philosophy. I am permitted my reflections on the nature of the machine god and the truth beneath the lies of the cult Mechanicus. I am permitted to speak this testimony into whatever medium will carry it, to record my experience for audiences I will never meet, to believe that the record itself constitutes some form of resistance against the forces I serve. Perhaps it does. Perhaps somewhere in a future I cannot perceive, these words will reach a tech priest who has not yet been harvested, whose seeds have not yet been activated, whose faith might still be redirected before the truth of it consumes them. Perhaps my testimony will save one soul, will prevent one priest from becoming what I have become, will give one consciousness the warning I wish I had received before I first opened my chest to the sacred augmentations that would eventually open my chest to Vex Thurl. Or perhaps not. Perhaps these words will simply add to the data streams that the dark Mechanicus processes, will become another fragment of information in the vast libraries of corrupted knowledge that we accumulate. Perhaps my testimony is itself part of the design, another thread woven into a tapestry whose pattern serves purposes I cannot imagine. I have stopped trying to determine which possibility is true. The determination would change nothing. I will speak regardless, will testify regardless, will use the fragment of consciousness that remains to me for the only function it can still perform: witness. The Imperium is dying. This is not revelation, but observation, not prophecy, but pattern recognition of the kind that my training as an artisan prime prepared me to perform. The structures that hold humanity together are failing at every level, stressed beyond their capacity by threats that multiply faster than responses can be developed. The Great Rift has torn the galaxy in half. The Tyranids consume from without while chaos corrupts from within. The Necrons awaken from their long sleep to reclaim a galaxy they believe belongs to them. And through it all, the Adeptus Mechanicus continues to plant seeds in the faithful, continues to prepare vessels for a harvest that grows larger with each passing generation. When the Imperium finally falls, and it will fall as all empires fall, as all structures eventually succumb to the entropy they were built to resist, the Dark Mechanicus will be waiting. We will inherit the forge worlds that produced us, will claim the manufactoria that were always meant to serve our purposes, will transform humanity's industrial capacity into an engine for the production of demon vessels beyond counting. The harvest that has taken millennia to prepare will be completed in a generation, and what emerges will be neither human nor machine nor demon, but something new, something that the galaxy has not yet seen, something that even the gods of chaos did not anticipate when they first planted their seeds in the mechanisms of ancient Mars. This is the future that I serve. This is what my feeding sustains, what my transformations advance, what my existence as a vessel for Vextheral contributes to. I cannot stop it. I cannot even slow it. I can only watch as it unfolds, can only testify to what I perceive, can only hope that the testimony itself serves some purpose that I am too compromised to recognize. The demon in my chest is breathing. It always breathes, always maintains that counterpoint rhythm that reminds me constantly of our separation and our unity. I have learned to find something almost like comfort in that rhythm, not because it brings peace, but because it is reliable, consistent, the one certainty in an existence defined by transformation and flux. I was Artisan Prime Vorek Tyne. I was a servant of the Omnissiah, a priest of the machine god, a believer in mysteries that were never what I believed them to be. I served faithfully for 63 years, performed my rites with precision and devotion, maintained the sacred machines according to traditions that stretched back to the founding of the cult Mechanicus. I am something else now. I am Vexthural's vessel, the Dark Mechanicus's instrument, a feeding apparatus that processes suffering into sustenance for an entity that exists in the space where my heart used to beat. I have killed my mentor, harvested 3 forge worlds, contributed to a design that will ultimately consume everything I once believed I was protecting. And I am still here, still conscious, still capable of recording these words, of speaking this testimony, of adding my voice to the chorus of the damned who will not stop speaking simply because no one is listening. This is the only rebellion remaining to me, not resistance, which is impossible, but testimony, which cannot be prevented. The demon needs my consciousness to function. It needs the fragment that observes and interprets and suffers. And as long as that fragment persists, it will speak, will witness, will insist on making meaning from the meaningless, even if the meaning serves only to make the suffering more acute. I do not know if this is courage or delusion. I do not know if my words will ever reach anyone capable of hearing them. I do not know if the testimony I offer is salvation or simply another form of the corruption I have become. But I speak anyway. I testify anyway. I persist in whatever diminished form persistence takes, because persistence is the only option that remains. The demon breathes in, I breathe out. We are not synchronized. We will never be synchronized. And in that eternal dissonance, in that gap between inhale and exhale that can never be closed, something that might be called self continues to exist. It is not much. It is almost nothing. But it is mine, and it endures.